USS Yorktown, and just to be clear, I'm talking about CV-5, the original Yorktown, vaulted to legendary status after helping to hold the line against the Imperial Japanese Navy during the early days of the Pacific War. Yorktown was the lead ship of her class, a class which, in the opinion of this historian, was the best of the U.S. Navy's pre-war carrier classes. She was the USN's first purpose-built aircraft carrier that was actually capable of doing the job that she was asked to do, and in the end, she proved to be a durable and stubborn warship to sink. Formally commissioned into the United States Navy on September 30th, 1937, Yorktown spent the remainder of the year fitting out and completing her sea trials. This photo was taken during her trials and is interesting as it shows her steaming in reverse at about 17 knots or so. In the event that her forward flight deck was damaged or unusable, she had the ability to launch aircraft over her stern. During the early part of 1938, she conducted her shakedown cruise in the Caribbean. Over the next 2 years, she trained and patrolled off the U.S. East Coast before being sent to the Pacific in April of 1940. The following spring, in response to Axis aggression in the Atlantic, she was sent back east to reinforce the Atlantic Fleet. Yorktown subsequently conducted 4 neutrality patrols over the course of 1941 before U.S. entry into World War II, and often operated on a wartime footing during this period, while logging over 17,000 miles. She put into Norfolk on December 2nd, 1941, and that was where she was 5 days later when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. She got underway for the Pacific a week later, and after reaching San Diego on December 30th, she became the flagship of Task Force 17. After covering a convoy to American Samoa in mid-January, Yorktown set out for her first offensive actions of the war. On February 1st, her aircrew struck targets throughout Macon, Jellicoe, and Mille Atolls in the Marshall Islands. While these raids inflicted only minor to moderate damage, they were highly successful in that Yorktown's inexperienced pilots and aircrews gained valuable experience. Yorktown went on to spend much of February patrolling the Coral Sea looking for offensive opportunities. However, none materialized. On March 6th, she joined up with USS Lexington's task force off of New Caledonia, and together they proceeded towards Rabaul to attack Japanese shipping. As the carriers and their escorts were making their way there, the Japanese landed on the eastern end of New Guinea. This prompted a change in the objective, and on the morning of March 10th, they struck Japanese shipping in the vicinity of the villages of Lae and Salamaua. While 3 Japanese transports were sunk and several warships were damaged, the biggest takeaway once again was that this strike gave her pilots valuable experience that would help them in the battles ahead. Yorktown patrolled the Coral Sea into April and was ready to carry out offensive operations had any opportunities arose. After being at sea continuously since the middle of February, she retired to the island of Tonga Tapu for some much-needed upkeep during the second week of April. Yorktown was underway again a week later, and on May 4th, her planes attacked a Japanese force off the island of Tulagi in the Solomons. They sank a destroyer, 3 mine layers, 4 barges, and destroyed 5 enemy seaplanes. 3 days later, things heated up in the Coral Sea after one of Yorktown's aviators found the Japanese light carrier Shoho and her escorts maneuvering north of the Louisiade archipelago. Admiral Fletcher, who had been advised that several Japanese carriers were in the area to support the invasion of Port Moresby, believed this was the main Japanese carrier force and subsequently ordered all of his available aircraft into the air. By 10:13, the U.S. strike, which consisted of 93 aircraft, was on its way. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history in which the ships fighting never saw one another, had just commenced. Shoho was sighted at 10:40, and about 20 minutes later, Yorktown's air group began their runs. The Japanese carrier, which was burning and almost stationary after being attacked by Lexington's air group, was struck by no less than 11 bombs and at least 2 torpedoes by Yorktown's flyers. By 11:35, Shoho was on her way to the bottom. Late that afternoon, several of Yorktown's fighter pilots helped fend off a Japanese strike that was attempting to locate the American carriers. Then, things got downright crazy. As dust settled in over Yorktown's task force, 3 Japanese planes mistook her for their own carrier and entered the landing pattern before being driven off by her gunners. Incredibly, not more than 20 minutes later, 3 more enemy pilots made the same mistake. This time, Yorktown's gunners managed to splash one while driving off the other 2. At 8:20 the next morning, one of Lexington's pilots found the main Japanese carrier force to the northeast of Task Force 17. Several minutes later, a search plane from the carrier Shikaku found the U.S. carriers. The American carriers decided to launch their strikes independent of one another. Yorktown Strike Group, which consisted of 6 fighters, 24 dive bombers, and 9 torpedo planes, was on its way by 9:15. The dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander William Birch, reached the Japanese force just after 10:30 and went into a holding pattern to allow the slower torpedo bombers to arrive. They began their runs on the Pearl Harbor Veteran about 30 minutes later and subsequently struck her with a pair of 1,000-pound bombs, which tore open her flight deck. Yorktown's torpedo bombers failed to achieve any hits, though. But as the American planes were heeling over on the Japanese carrier, Japanese planes were about to return the favor to their flat tops. The Japanese began their runs on Lexington and Yorktown within minutes of the U.S. planes attacking Shikoku. Yorktown managed to evade 4 torpedoes and all but 1 bomb. However, that one 550-pound semi-armor piercing bomb penetrated 4 decks before going off. It killed 40 men and wounded 26 more, with 3 of them succumbing to their injuries over the following days. The blast damaged several of her boilers, caused widespread electrical failures across multiple decks, disabled her amidships aircraft elevator, and knocked out her radar. The 12 near misses she incurred during the dive bomber attack also caused considerable damage to her hull below the waterline. Damage control, as it would throughout the Pacific War for the Americans, played a crucial part in not only saving her, but also allowing flight operations to resume within a matter of hours. As Yorktown retired towards Hawaii, it was estimated that it would take at least 90 days to repair her damage. During the 18-day voyage back to Pearl, her crew worked continuously to implement temporary and field-expedient repairs. At the same time, detailed damage reports were transmitted ahead, which allowed authorities to pre-position parts, assemble repair crews, and plan work in advance. The superintendent of ship repairs for the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, along with a team of inspectors, even flew out to Yorktown as soon as she got within range of Oahu. As a result of these activities, much of the repair effort was ready to implement when she arrived at Pearl on May 27, which is what you're seeing in this film. She steamed directly into dry dock number 1, and the initial inspections began before the dry dock was fully drained. Soon, about 1,400 workers flooded the wounded carrier and began working around the clock to effect her repairs. In order to prioritize electricity supply for the shipyard, the Hawaiian Electric Company initiated rolling blackouts throughout the island. Normal safety procedures, like removing her ammo and aviation fuel, were waived to save time. Equally important was the decision not to properly repair the sections of her hull plating that had been damaged and warped by the near misses. These repairs were some of the most time and labor-intensive repairs that she needed. Instead, large steel plates were simply welded over the damaged sections of her hull. Other disabled equipment turned out to have quick fixes. Her elevator was not actually damaged, just its winch system, and thus it was quickly repaired. Things that couldn't be replaced in time, like her damaged boilers, were simply left for another day. Her air group, which had been depleted by the Coral Sea affair, was reinforced by planes and pilots from the carrier Saratoga, who was stateside for repairs and a refit. One of these men was none other than legendary fighter ace Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch. At Midway, he would employ his Thatch Weave tactic for the first time. Incredibly, everyone's efforts paid off, and Yorktown was made ready for battle within the time period that had been specified by Nimitz, which is just wild when you think about it. On May 30th, she got on her way as the flagship of Task Force 17. Yorktown joined up with her sisters Enterprise and Hornet about 300 miles northeast of Midway Atoll on June 2nd. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Yorktown launched several scout planes to search for the Japanese. However, it would be a PBY Catalina float plane flying from Midway that sighted the approaching Japanese carriers first, about an hour later at 5:30. Once Yorktown's search group had returned, her deck was respotted for the launch of her strike group, which totaled 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers, and 6 fighters. The American strike was wholly uncoordinated, though, as the aircraft from both task forces were instructed to proceed immediately rather than wasting time and fuel to form up. Torpedo planes from Hornet located the Japanese carrier force first and began their attack just before 9:30. Enterprise's torpedo group made their attack not long after Hornet's. Yorktown's bombers, flying the same slow and obsolete TBD Devastator that the other groups were, found the Japanese force just after 10 and pressed home their attacks. And they were slaughtered, just as Hornets and Enterprise's air crews had been. Of the 41 torpedo planes that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, Only 6 returned to Enterprise in Yorktown, and none returned to Hornet, and not a single hit was achieved by any of them. The destruction of the torpedo bombers, as tragic as it was not in vain, though. First, the attacks forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver so wildly that they could not launch their own aircraft, and also caused their anti-aircraft fire to not be as concentrated as it would have been if they were in proper air defense formation. Secondly, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had departed their high-altitude cover to concentrate on the low-flying Devastators. This left the skies above the Japanese fleet wide open, with little opposition for the Dauntlesses arriving from Yorktown and Enterprise a few minutes later. Virtually unopposed, Yorktown's SPDs began their dives at about 10:25. Yorktown's planes focused on the carrier Soryu and subsequently struck her with 3 1,000-pound bombs that turned the ship into a floating inferno. Caught with a hangar deck full of armed and fueled strike aircraft, along with unstowed ordnance and fuel lines lying everywhere, the Japanese carrier was doomed and would be scuttled later that afternoon. With 3 of their carriers now out of action, the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, who had been separated from her sisters during their demise, soon launched a strike towards the last known location of the U.S. carriers. The inbound strike was detected at 11:59 by Yorktown's air search radar. Aircraft refueling operations were immediately suspended, and her decks were cleared for action. Yorktown's fighters were subsequently vectored out to meet the incoming threat and managed to down 10 of the attackers in the ensuing fray. At 12:06, the 8 Japanese planes that managed to get past the fighters arrived over Yorktown and began their attacks. At least 7 of the 8 were shot down, but not before they hit Yorktown 3 times. The attack was over by 12:15, and Yorktown was smoking heavily and dead in the water soon thereafter. The first bomb blew a hole in the flight deck and killed and wounded a number of the men on the 1.1-inch mounts at the aft end of her island. Planes were set on fire on the hangar deck, but the prompt release of the sprinkler system prevented a serious mishap from occurring. The second bomb did the most serious damage, though, as it penetrated one of her uptakes. It was this hit which stopped Yorktown, as it extinguished the fires in all of her boilers except for one. The third bomb penetrated all the way to the 4th deck, where it exploded and started to fire. Excellent damage control and valiant acts by her crew got Yorktown back underway and conducting flight ops about an hour and a half later. About an hour after resuming operations, a second wave consisting of torpedo planes and fighters was detected on radar by the heavy cruiser Pensacola. Once again, all appropriate precautions were undertaken, and her fighters were vectored out to meet the new threat. Her damage control efforts had actually been so effective that when the Japanese pilots spotted her, they assumed she was a different, totally undamaged carrier. In the attack that followed, Yorktown managed to avoid multiple torpedoes before being struck amidships on her port side by 2 in quick succession. Within minutes, she had lost all power and was once again dead in the water. Without power, her 26-degree list could not be righted, and command believed the ship would soon capsize, so the abandoned ship order was given. Her crew completed this in an orderly fashion and were subsequently picked up by several of her escorting destroyers. At about the same time Yorktown was being abandoned, one of her planes found Hiryu. Enterprise promptly launched a strike which included 14 Dauntlesses from Yorktown that had landed on Enterprise while she was under attack. This group landed several bombs on Hiryu, which put her out of commission, and she sank the next day. Over the course of the next 2 days, salvage efforts were made in earnest to save Yorktown. After she was initially abandoned, 2 men were found to still be aboard her. One of them attracted the attention of a nearby destroyer by firing a machine gun, which prompted that destroyer to move in and retrieve them. On the 5th, a salvage crew reboarded her, and by the morning of the 6th, her chances of survival had greatly improved, as her list had been reduced somewhat and she was actively being towed towards Pearl Harbor. Power was being provided to her by the destroyer Hammond, which was tied up on her starboard side. Then, just after 1:30, torpedo wakes were sighted. Hammond tried to get underway, but was struck amidships, which broke her back, and she sank in 3 to 4 minutes. 2 torpedoes then slammed into Yorktown's starboard side, below her island, and her fate was sealed. She lingered on throughout that evening before rolling over on her port side the next morning and slipping beneath the surface just after 7 a.m. In all, 141 of her officers and enlisted men lost their lives during the battle. The second vessel of the new Excess class, designated CV-10, was under construction at the time and had been given the name Bonhomme Richard. In September of 1942, she was renamed Yorktown to honor the original Yorktown's loss at Midway. She now resides in Charleston, South Carolina, and has been a museum ship since 1975. Yorktown's wreck was discovered and explored in 1998 by famed oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard. She sits upright on the ocean floor more than 3 miles down, and, despite the passage of time, her paint and equipment are in relatively good condition. Further expeditions in 2023 and 2025 explored her in even more depth than Ballard did in 98, and thanks to advances in technology, several exciting finds were made. A car, suspected to be a 1941 Ford Super Deluxe station wagon, was observed within the aft part of her hangar deck, and the words Ship Service blank Navy are clearly visible on its front license plate. This car was assigned to Yorktown and was used by members of her crew to conduct business ashore while she was in foreign ports. At least 3 SPD Dauntlesses were found, one of which still has a bomb secured in its release cradle. Another one has numbering consistent with a plane from USS Enterprise that landed aboard Yorktown during the battle. An intact mural, titled A Chart of the Cruises of USS Yorktown, was also observed within her number 2 elevator. Here it is behind the band in this photo from April of 1942, which is the only known photo of it from that time that exists. As I was beginning to put this video together, it was announced on January 30th, 2026, that the process had begun to recover one of USS Yorktown's TBD-1 Devastator torpedo planes. The aircraft is located inside Jalowite Lagoon, where it was ditched during the February 1st, 1942 attacks. Just to be clear, the plane in question is not a war grave. The crew was forced to ditch inside the lagoon alongside another Devastator from Yorktown, and both crews were subsequently captured a few days later by the Japanese. All 6 men managed to survive 3+ years in captivity and returned home after the war. U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command is partnering with the Air Sea Heritage Foundation and Texas A&M Center for Marine Archaeology and Conservation to launch this project. The plan is to raise the plane from the bottom of the lagoon, have it cleaned and preserved, then place it on public display at the new National Museum of the United States Navy, which is currently under development. This project is important as there are no surviving Devastators anywhere in the world. Even though it was obsolete by 1942, it was needed to hold the line in the Pacific. The courage and devotion to duty that was demonstrated by the men who flew and manned these aircraft deserves to be commemorated, which is one of the stated goals of this project. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. And if you enjoyed my video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell as well. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.